Insights. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Private Market Labs, a new platform designed to democratize the small business acquisition process. This podcast series is designed to provide just insights to the community, actionable advice from the best experts. And we've got two of my favorite people in the small business M&A world here with me today. Must be doing something right because this is both of their second time on the Private Market Insights series. So without further ado, I'll introduce our guests and we'll get started. So first off, we have Jarryd Johnson. He is the Vice President and Senior Business Officer at First Internet Bank, a leading lender when it comes to the SBA financing world. Jarryd also has his own podcast, Before You Buy and Sell a Business, so make sure to listen to that. I think y'all's episode just came out today. I think I saw that on LinkedIn maybe a couple of hours ago. So our second guest is also named Jarryd. We have Jarryd Osborne here. He has worn a ton of hats in the small business M&A world, most recently as a buy-side advisor at ReVera Capital. Jarryd is one of my most important sounding boards when it comes to the experience of buyers and investors in our space. And he was also Jarryd Johnson's most recent podcast guest. So if you like this conversation, really make sure to check that out as well. And if you don't like it, it's probably my fault. So still check out that episode. Anyway, it was fantastic. So we're trying a bit of a different format today. We have two guests. And so we're going to do a little sports podcast meets mergers and acquisitions podcast. And we're going to do this power ranking style. So each of you have come up with your top 5 reasons deals in the small business M&A world tend to die. So we're just going to go back and forth, discuss each of your lists. And if there's disagreement or overlap, we can get into that as well. So let's jump right in. I guess I'm going to refer to both of your full names because if I say Jarryd, you're not going to know who I'm talking about. So Jarryd Johnson, what is your first reason why M&A deals die?
Yeah, I think I didn't put them necessarily in order, but first one was basically when attorneys kind of get in the way and start fighting with each other and draw it out, get hung up on something.
Gotcha. So why is that like a big problem? And Jarryd Osborne, is that something that you've seen when you've been working through some of your deals as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And matter of fact, Jarryd Johnson has pretty much upfront experience on a deal that I had gone through with an attorney who essentially contributed in killing my deal. I wouldn't say that 100% killed my deal, but contributed. And so, yeah, I see it on my end as well.
Gotcha. So what exactly did the attorney do? So when you have an attorney, I know we've heard a lot of conversation around, if there's an attorney that's not experienced in M&A, is that what you're talking about? Or is it really any kind of attorney that can be a problem here?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. You're right. So for this particular incident, the first issue was that their attorney was an employment attorney, right? So they weren't an M&A attorney. And so, this individual was very educated and very knowledgeable on, what they know about law from their standpoint, just not from an M&A standpoint. And so it created a lot of extra time in terms of, educating, her on, what needs to be done or what's normal or what's market in such transactions. And mainly as it pertains to the purchase agreement. And so, yeah, that was the first one. And then the second one was actually probably my attorney. So, and for reference, this was actually one of my deals that I was actually going to buy. Josh had kind of introduced myself as a buy-side advisor, but before an advisor, I was a searcher. And so my attorney actually kind of took over the deal, and I let him take over the deal. And there was a few arguments that took place where I should have stepped in and took control over the negotiations, but instead I let him take over negotiations, and it just didn't end well. You have a more emotional vested interest as the borrower, right, as the searcher, and always keep that in mind. I did not keep that in mind at that moment, and I just kind of let the kind of attorneys battle it out, if you will. whereas I should have stepped in for sure.
Jarryd, Johnson, do you see situations like this? Obviously, you see a ton of deals as a lender. Is this something that, running into attorneys that are inexperienced or that are nitpicking, this was your on your list. So do you have any examples of when a deal has died because of a attorney interference?
Yeah, I think we talk about it a lot. There's kind of an emotional roller coaster during the transaction, and a lot of times the attorneys can kind of get buried into a certain topic or a certain part of the deal that they're hung up on. We're trying in no way to bash attorneys. There's some great ones out there that do an excellent job, but there's a lot of times where you kind of expect them to try to prove their worth. And so sometimes they're digging in on something and just kind of over analyzing something and just throwing way too many words at something or just really getting hung up on it. And then both sides start to kind of wear down and get a little tired. That, and then of course the cost that comes along with it, when it just starts to really build up. I had a transaction I ended up closing maybe 2-3 months ago. It took about 9 months to close, and the biggest issue was the attorneys going back and forth, and combined between the two, it was over $170,000 in legal fees. So on a $3.5 million, or it was like $5 million transaction, it was just kind of ridiculous. They were treating it more like a $30 million acquisition. So fortunately, that one got done, but there was plenty of times throughout the process where the emotions are going back and forth and the attorneys were just not helping at all, just getting stuck on one little topic here and there. So we see it happen quite a bit. And again, not having a competent attorney, one that does not deal with either SBA lending, more SMB type M&A transactions, can really kill your deal, because they're kind of trying to figure out as they go, and they might be bringing up terms or holding up the deal on certain aspects that really don't need to be discussed or addressed, just simply because they don't have the experience for it.
Yeah. So it sounds like a couple of the lessons learned from both of these stories is kind of, one, find an M&A attorney that's actually experienced in M&A. Don't go for a labor attorney or an employment attorney from that perspective. And two, Jarryd Osborne, to your point, I think I'm sort of trying to wrap both of these comments together a little bit, which is, since you're the lead in negotiating your own deal, make sure that the attorneys know what you find, what's important to you, what you need protection from, and where do we just press ahead in order to avoid both time, money lost, and getting bogged down in the weeds. Does that sound like I've accurately summarized kind of this point?
Yeah, and I would add to that, sometimes we get into this sequence of, during our meetings, we have to have the attorney on all calls, right, as it pertains to legal matters. And you do want your attorney on most of those calls. Now, sometimes when things get a little bit heated, it may make sense to do an outside call with the seller, right, or an outside call with the seller's broker, and just kind of personalize the situation a little bit more to hash out things without attorneys. Not always, but in some cases, that might be a measure to take to relieve some of that tension that's built up.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Very cool. Well, Jarryd Osborne, the floor is yours. What is your first, fifth, however order you want to go in, deal killer that you want to bring up?
I'll just go with what I listed number one, and that's unorganized financials, right? And so I guess that can mean many different things, but if you're asking for a P&L or 3 years worth of P&Ls, and sometimes they're sent over an accrual basis or cash basis, right? SBA lenders want to see both, right? And so it's really just, once the documentation is asked for, how do we get it from the seller, right? And that can mean so many things, right? Sometimes they're the deals that are not brokered, those things can be a little bit harder to obtain, right? Because the seller is running their business. They don't have time to speak to their CPA or their accountant to get this entire, long list that the SBA requires. And then sometimes even a broker deal, right? It's all about timing, as Jarryd will probably mention too, in getting those documents over faster. The faster those documents can get there, the faster a bank or an SBA lender can underwrite the deal, right? And so we all heard that time kills all deals. Well, unorganized financials leads into more time, which ultimately sometimes can kill deals.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I'm curious, especially on this point, right? We're in the weeds looking at a ton of deals, especially on the brokerage side all the time. And I'm sure this is even more, and this is also an issue, to your point, Jarryd, on the off market side as well. But when you see financials, I think reconciling what financials you're seeing versus how the financials that everyone sort of agrees on and gets comfortable with, I think that can be a little bit of a process as well. What is sort of both of your experience working through that conversation? So it's sort of like, it seems like it's step one, to your point, finding and getting a hold of the financials. And then it's, how do we agree on what do those financials say? There's a conversations about add backs, conversations about, accounting bases, things like that.
Yeah, I would say we could probably talk about this for 4 hours. Probably one of the big discrepancies that we often see are the difference between the financials and the tax returns. Being an SBA lender, we're required to use tax returns. Now, if you're not getting SBA lending and you're either paying cash, sell or carry, however you're working it out, you could rely on the actual financial statements. And then taking it even a step further, we get quite a bit of clients that don't even do their financials during the year. They're waiting until the end and just piling everything on their accountant's desk and ask them to do tax returns, which just blows my mind, because we're sitting there going, hey, how are you doing so far this year? Oh, I don't know. I've got money in my bank account. I must be okay. Not being able to keep up with your margins and everything else is just mind blowing. But, one of the biggest kind of breakdowns with the financials, I think, is when you get a savvy buyer or a buyer that is looking for financing or both, they're going to rely pretty heavily on the financials, and being able to request something and the seller being able to provide it quickly kind of gives us a lot of information about how the business is being operated, and then how that transaction is going to take place, and kind of how much reliance we can actually put on those financials. Are they truly valid? That's not to say that if somebody's doesn't have a great accounting software or background and is not, completely, updating the financials often, it doesn't mean that it's a bad deal or anything. But as we get more and more competent buyers that are, paying a lot more attention to all of the information that's starting to come out more about business acquisitions, they're going to start really looking for businesses that have clean financials.
Yeah, that makes sense. Jarryd Osborne, as a buyer, do you ever see a situation where the financials aren't super clean, but the buyer, whether it's you in your past experience or a buyer that you've been working with, the buyer wants to move ahead for other reasons? And, where are the situations where, hey, this deal looks really attractive, but I can't get the financials to square off? Like, where does that dropping off point be between, hey, these financials are messy, but I still like the deal, to these financials are too messy and I'm going to pass?
Yeah, I guess that would depend if you're kind of pre-LOI or post-LOI, right? So, I mean, if you're pre-LOI, we're trying to get the basics, right? We're trying to get those tax returns. We're trying to get the P&Ls, the balance sheets, the AR report. And sometimes, in some cases, you don't get those tax returns. And so, to your point, you have to feel comfortable going forward posting an LOI, right? And so you just have to get comfortable with those risks. But, how you mitigate those risks is all how you write the LOI, right? Are you mitigating those risks through some type of language saying, hey, we didn't see the tax return, so, financial due diligence, price and valuations all contingent upon financial due diligence, right? And if it's post LOI, at me as an advisor is, ultimately it's your decision. You're going to buy this company, but you have to understand these risks, right? And I'm going to try to coach them and walk them through those risks. Be it customer concentration, be it maybe certain ad backs aren't able to be fully reconciled. Maybe somebody sold a car or some, a car purchase, or maybe there's a PPP in there. Or, maybe there's some trips in there that, don't really seem like ad backs. Yeah. At this point, it's up to the borrower or the buyer, right, to really question and make sure how relevant are these or how sticky are these, and then kind of add those up and make a judgment call there.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. Anything else to add, or you want to move on to the next one, Jarryd Johnson?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we could just go for hours, I'm sure. I mean, it kind of almost bleeds into like, a due diligence, coming up with something in due diligence as well. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the financials are really what tells us the story. There are people that maybe are in the same industry that are kind of used to financials looking a certain way, and they're a little bit more comfortable compared to somebody from the outside that has maybe worked in corporate America, where they've got, quite a few accountants on staff that are keeping everything clean, or they absolutely have to abide by GAAP because they're publicly traded or something. So when they are looking from the outside and they see a business that doesn't even, they don't even have the ability to tell you how much inventory they have on hand, it makes them a lot more nervous compared to somebody that's in the industry that says, oh, that's how pretty much everybody did. That's how my dad did it. My grandpa did it, and so they're a little bit more comfortable with it. But yeah, it's definitely one of the biggest things that I think people are starting to really understand a lot more.
Yeah, and it's crazy because you think, coming in this business and you're talking to a seller, you think that they know everything about their business from a financial perspective. Like, I can't tell you, probably in the last 3 months, I've talked to at least 2 clients that were doing 40 million in revenue, but they couldn't tell me what their cash flow or EBITDA was, right? And so, it's one of those things like, here, accountant, you figure it out and you tell the buyer. And so sometimes they don't know, and it's not to blame them, right? They're operating a company. They have 50, 60, 70 employees, and they're managing products and clients. So it's not to blame them. It's just, it is a reality that financials can get unorganized, and that not all sellers know their financials, as you might expect.
Yeah. Interesting. Thanks, Scott. Jarryd Johnson, what's next? What's next?
Yeah, the next one I had on my list was not having somebody to kind of quarterback the transaction in between the buyer and seller. Whether that's a broker or an attorney. I often say that the deals where the buyer and seller kind of come to me and say, hey, we want to buy this business, I end up being the broker in the middle of it. And it's usually a lot more work, and it's a little bit more frustrating trying to deal with both sides. It does work from time to time where buyer and seller maybe are friendly, or they just kind of have a good understanding of each other. But more times than not, it's what gets things to blow up, because there's not somebody there to kind of ask the right questions, maybe even pose the questions the right way, keep the personalities away from each other, so they're not running into each other and causing some strife between the two of them. So I'd say that's probably one of the biggest things that I've seen.
Yeah. Jarryd Osborne, I know you had non-broker deals on your top 5 also. What's your perspective on this topic?
Yeah, I would say, once I started out as a buyer, I had a different perspective, right? Because as buyers, we tend to be coached, or we tend to be taught in the industry that we don't want a broker involved, right? Because we're going to get a better deal. But you can't think of it like that. A broker-led deal, most broker-led deals are going to be have a little better cadence, have a little better sequence, and they're going to move faster, right? And so, a couple of years ago, we worked on a deal, and the buyer had met this seller on LinkedIn, right? And they end up forming a good relationship, and 6 or 7 months later, they're still in due diligence, right? And so it's, they never got to that point where they could close because everything took so long. And so A broker, is going to be there to kind of lead the seller on, what needs to be presented and move the process along. Just like we've all bought a house before, or most of us have, and we know what that transaction's like. Buyers and sellers, there's agents in there for a reason, right? To get those kind of emotions out of the equation, as Jarryd mentioned, I think is very key.
Yeah, I'd also add that they actually know how the transaction's supposed to go and the like kind of normal path, where otherwise they're kind of running blind and trying to rely on a lender or maybe escrow to kind of keep them on track. And those are usually the deals that end up just having a lot of issues back and forth because they don't know exactly what needs to be done step by step. So they'll kind of get out of order, and then it just ends up causing some frustrations between everybody.
Yeah, no, these are all great points. As you've worked with brokers in the past, what are some of the most successful strategies for getting the broker aligned with you as a buyer or you as a lender and the seller to kind of move the deal forward? I think we've all heard, and Jarryd Osborne, to your point, we've been coached as buyers to pursue the off-market deal. And I think that there's probably some fair, some unfair criticism about brokers in our space. How do we make the most out of having that person in the middle and making sure that we're managing that relationship well so that the deal actually does flow quickly and at the cadence that we want?
I mean, I think first off, you just treat them like a person and a professional, right? And you're respectful, and you're following up. The thing I always say is pick up the phone, right? If you want a listing and you want to build a good relationship with a broker, pick up the phone, don't email, and talk to them, right? Most brokers will talk to you, right? And so just kind of build a relationship and treat that individual, as a person who's representing a seller, and, build a relationship and don't treat it like a transaction.
Very cool. Great. Anything else to add on this particular topic, or we ready to move on to the next?
I would just like kind of hit on again what you were saying about how brokers sometimes get a bad rap with in these types of transactions, and it makes sense because there are some brokers that just don't know what they're doing, or maybe they come from maybe they got improper training, or they learned from somebody who they really shouldn't have. But there are some excellent brokers out there that do very, very well, and they've kind of learned the right way, and they're very experienced. So it's probably something to really take into consideration when you're looking at a transaction. If the broker's not seeming to kind of act right while you're asking for stuff from the seller, probably kind of have your guard up and be a little more cautious on that transaction.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I think Jarryd Osborne, it's your turn. What is your next big deal killer?
Yeah, I think this will probably be one of our favorites. Seller valuation expectations, right? I mean, we can go all kinds of ways with this, but what I find and happens in a lot of deals is that the seller wants their number, right? The broker even the broker that's representing the seller can tell them the company is worth $5 million, but before the seller has even engaged with the broker, they have a number in their head, right? And so sometimes sell side brokers can't get that number out of their head, so they take the listing, right? And so that can lead down to a different rabbit hole I don't want to go down to. But all that to say is that's why you see a lot of sometimes overvalued companies on biz buy sell or some of these marketplaces, which I think speaks to, depending on which article or stats you read, 10 to 15% of all listed transactions close, right? Only 10 to 15%. So, and I think a lot of that has to do with overvaluation, or sellers just kind of testing the market, if you will, right? And so we can go several different angles on this one, but valuation expectations can really create a lot of, fake transactions out there or fake listings out there that sometimes can, get in the way of us buyers actually finding a really motivated seller.
Gotcha. And Jarryd Johnson, obviously you see this as from the lender's point of view. How do you, in particular, are you coming in and seeing a deal when you're coming in, especially when you're coming in early to a deal and you see maybe there's a band of a disagreement where, that has to be closed between what the buyer thinks the deal is worth, what the seller thinks the deal is worth? What are some techniques that you've seen in deals that have closed in order to help close that gap?
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is another great item to talk about. I see a lot of deals on the front end before they get listed, where they'll come to me and say, "Hey, is this something that you could potentially do a loan for?" It's not to completely pick on the brokers, but a lot of times it's the same brokers over and over again that are doing the same thing, or almost to where they're sending me a deal and I don't even want to look at it because I'm like, I'm going to have to go back to them and tell them it's overpriced and then beat them up on where did they come up with these numbers. And we're not going to add back every single line item on the expenses. So I think it's kind of like 3-part on where they're coming up with, missing the valuation. I think that one of the biggest ones is listening to the seller and trying to give the seller what they want, right? So there's a really good broker that I work with, and her philosophy is when a seller comes to him and says that they want to sell and they want to list, she tells them, don't tell me what you want to sell it for. Don't even mention it. I'm going to do all my own valuation and I'm going to come back to you and I'm going to tell you what I would list it for. And you can tell me where I'm at. That way, she's not sitting there trying to stretch and squeeze more ad backs out and stuff to try to get to that number. That's probably one of the best ways to do it. The other part of it is just using unrealistic ad backs or not having good financials that then, with a proper multiple, most likely is pushing up the value to list it. But when you actually get a hold of the financials and the tax returns, most likely a buyer or a lender is not going to accept all of those ad backs, which then kind of brings the valuation back down. And then kind of the third way is also just making sure that essentially the cash flow works from a lending standpoint. Even if they're not getting a loan, the buyer has an expectation of what type of return they want. And if that multiple is way too high, it doesn't make any sense for them to go put hundreds of thousands of dollars at risk for such a small return. If they want to do that, they can go buy, commercial real estate or something. It just doesn't make sense. And then from a lending standpoint of kind of how I get them to understand that it's priced inaccurately. A lot of times what I'll do is either grab the buyer or the broker or sometimes both, and we'll jump on Zoom. I'll share my screen and I'll go through with them. These are the numbers. This is what, you're actually going to get. This is what an appraiser is going to use. Here's the most recent, 5 or 6 deals I've done in this category. And here's the multiple that the appraiser used. So here's where I'm coming up with this valuation. Now, of course, I'm not an appraiser, so I could be wrong, but usually it's not by much. So when you have somebody that's just grossly overvalued, and then kind of also working backwards and showing them there's not enough excess cash flow here to pay us back. So I already know it's not going to appraise. So, if I found that if I can actually show them, they can't necessarily argue back with me because, at the end of the day, we're showing them kind of hard evidence and data of what the value is. And then they're able to actually, get in line and realize that, okay, that's where I'm supposed to be. And a lot of times the sellers say, hey, you know what, you're right. This is a person I want to sell it to. This is what I want to do. I'm going to go ahead and come down on it. Some of the other things we've done, if it's just slightly over, but that buyer really wants it and they're willing to pay for it, maybe we'll do a seller carry note on complete standby. or even if it's maybe on standby for 3 years and then, it's on repayment for 2 with a balloon or something like that. We can get pretty creative usually with the seller carry notes. But where we struggle, and everyone's going to struggle, is when it's just a huge gap, more than, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000. If they're willing to buy it, then we've got to really, really understand why, that they're willing to pay that much over for it. So, and then sometimes sellers just decide, hey, maybe it's not the right time to sell. I'm going to go back and spend 18 months, filing my taxes the way I'm supposed to and paying my taxes, and then I'll go back and sell it when I can. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of keep that transaction going. But if they're absolutely ready to sell and be done and most likely retire, they usually are going to kind of come down to reality and get the right valuation out.
Yeah. Sometimes it might take 8 or 9, 10 months for that reality to check, but sometimes they do come around. Like, for example, I've seen a listing for 3 years now. Company's doing 2 million EBITDA, wants 14x. And so, one of the things I told them was, you're priced like a publicly traded stock. And he was like, yeah, and I'm sticking to it. And here he is. I just called him a couple months ago, still listed. So
he's been watching Shark Tank too much.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So they're out there, but there's a flip side, like Jarryd said, is that there's ways to gap or to mitigate those gaps between those valuations. Obviously with SBA you can't do earnouts or clawbacks or anything like that, but you can do contingent seller notes with performance tied to it. And so, I think utilizing those tools, because maybe at the end of the day you think that the seller wants a number and maybe you're okay. It's kind of alluding to your question earlier, Josh, is maybe you have to get okay because you love the business so much and that you have these extra levers that you have at your disposal that you can pull to fill those gaps. And so, the devil's in the details and there's nuances, and sometimes you just got to keep diving to figure those out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, guys. Oh, Jarryd,
nope,
do you have something else?
Yeah, I mean, again, we could talk about all of these for hours.
Yeah, all these are maybe like 10 different podcast ideas. So if anyone else is doing an M&A podcast, this is looking for topics. This is a good one. The chat is open, so if you have questions for our guests, we're gonna keep going back and forth for a little while longer. But just to let everybody know, if you have questions, we will take questions certainly at the end. So please put those in the chat as we go forward. Jarryd Johnson, it's your turn.
My next one, I'm a little biased on this, but not working with the right lender. So it's probably one of the biggest things I see, and more of what I see happen is so I'll have somebody come to me, I'll work something up, maybe give them a term sheet. I'm ready to go. Like, we're going to get that deal done. I know it. We're ready to go. And then they say, well, XYZ lender can do it for less costs, or maybe they're offering some insane rate. And usually I'll ask them, hey, who's the lender? And normally kind of what I tell them is like, hey, if I don't know them or I don't have like a personal relationship with them, there's a high likelihood you're not getting this thing done. Those of us that actually do deals and get stuff done, we all kind of know each other. So sometimes it is a lender I know, and I say, hey, great, tell them I said hi. If they're willing to do that, then good for you. But a lot of times what happens is they're talking to maybe a larger bank or even a real tiny SBA lender that really does not do business acquisition financing. And they're sitting there telling them that they can get it done. And I'm telling them, no, they can't. I've done this, more than anybody. And they end up going with them. And more often than not, 4 weeks later, they come crawling back and they kind of say, hey, you were right. I'm sorry. But can you hurry up and get this closed? And a lot of times what I see happening is the seller at that point in time says, I'm done. I'm not spending another, adding it to it now 60 days from that point to get it done. I'm not willing to kind of go down that path with you again. I've seen many, many times where that seller is burned out, or I've had it also be where that seller picks up 2 clients during that time and they look at it and go, I'd be stupid to sell right now. I'm about to go, increase my revenue. And a year from now, my company is going to be worth, another 1.5 times what I'm selling it for. So, when you've got it under contract, make sure you pick the right lender, somebody that is very experienced, that does this often, that you can reference check with other people, and they're actually going to get it done, because you kind of get one shot at it most of the time, because you're definitely in danger of losing that transaction.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and there's probably one bank that one large bank that I can think of that gets a lot of deal flow, but doesn't actually end up closing. And I'm sure, Jarryd, you know who I'm talking about. But yeah, I would take Jarryd's comment even one step further. Not only get the right lender, get the right person at that bank or at that lending institution. There are situations where, for example, we had a borrower go to one of the top 5 SBA lenders in the country. The file set on this individual's on desk, per se, the entire package, for 2 weeks without any response, right? And so we kept following up. Is any movement, anything going on? And we would just kind of get the runaround and say, hey, we're working on it. And then, at this time, obviously, we're 2 weeks into exclusivity, right? We're under LOI, so we got to move. And so we start shopping other banks. But turns out a month later, another individual at that same institution messaged me and said, hey, do you have any deals? And I said, yeah, we just sent you one. But you did nothing with it. And then, and so I gave them kind of an overview of what was being done, right? An overview of the valuation of the business. They said, oh, we would underwrote that real quick. Well, it turns out we had another bank underwrite that thing within 30 days. And actually that bank happens to be First Internet Bank, where Jarryd Johnson is. And so, Jarryd Johnson approved the deal, and the other lender, just said on the file. So again, get the right person at that right bank. And I'll take that point just a step further if I can, is that some individuals may have more tenure, right? Some BDOs may have more tenure at their banks. And so the investment committees or the underwriting teams trust their deals more, right? Than, let's say, a less tenured individual, or an individual who might have brought deals that they haven't been so confident in, right? So again, I would just say focus on getting the right person at that bank, which is not easy to do, especially if you're fresh in the game. That's why you reach out to your resources like us, and we'll help guide you that direction.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason Tom Brady gets all the calls, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. That's really helpful advice. So I guess you mentioned that there was kind of that 2 week period where you were following up. Is there anything looking back you say, hey, if I had done X differently, I might have been able to switch banks sooner? Like, what was sort of what are some of the indicators for you, or things that you would suggest people do if they find themselves in that situation where they think a deal is sitting on someone's desk?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, if banks I've worked with have typically given me, some answer, and maybe not the answer saying, hey, we're going to approve this loan, but something of, more substance versus, hey, we're looking into it. So if you start reading in the emails or the communication, you could tell that they've actually looked at the deal, right? And they know a little bit about the financials, right? There's a lot of BDOs out there. There's a lot of lenders out there, right? And so they know they're competing against each other. So I would say, if they're not responding within 24 hours, you guys, I would say move. And, it's really that quick, right? And so I would use time as one of your testing measurements there.
Gotcha. Yeah. No, that's super helpful. So I'm looking at both of y'all's lists that you sent me. I think there's one more that is on both of your lists that hasn't come up yet, and that is Jarryd Osborne. Do you want to take the lead on seller-buyer relationship and some of the challenges with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, during a transaction and at any given time, especially at the beginning, the buyer and the seller, they're focused on the operations of the business. They're focused on the financials. They're focused on the geography, the clientele, right? The product, which is all very valid. But the relationship, I think, is a very important aspect, right? The buyer-seller relationship, building that rapport, getting to know the seller as a person, getting to know the seller's motivation about how they started a business. Is their family involved? What's their background, right? And so, I think especially when you're first meeting a seller, you don't want to start off the conversation. How much did you make last year?
Right.
And so you're just not starting off on a good foot. And you might think that, well, you have the money or you have the capital or you're going to come in with a high offer. So that's going to negate what that relationship that you have not built. And 9 times out of 10, it's not. The seller is going to have other buyers lined up, right? If it's a good business, and they're going to be able to select and choose who they mesh with, who they could see selling their business, right? And I think also times we get into that hole of, hey, well, they're selling the business anyway. They don't really care all that much about me, but they do, right? They care about the legacy. They care about their employees that you're about to take over. And so they want to know you. And I think you should also get to know them as a person and just build a very personal relationship. And that helps in negotiations too, right? It doesn't only help just for them selecting you to buy the business, but it helps if there's any snags or tension that gets built up 2 or 3 months down in the middle of negotiation. That rapport you built with, let's say, on a more friendly basis, will help ease some of those negotiation points.
Yeah. Jarryd Johnson, anything to add? I know this one was on your list as well.
Yeah, definitely. I would say out of everything, this is probably the one that happens the most often, where they kind of get in the same room or some way or another, they kind of get into a disagreement. I've seen it also work the other way, where a buyer and seller it's so much in tune that the seller's basically like, hey, yeah, I'll give you more working capital, I'll give you the AR, I'll give you the inventory. Like they're so excited to sell it to that one individual because they know they're going to carry it on the right way that they just bend over backwards to make sure that it happens. So it can really affect the transaction. I've always kind of been, of the mind of try to keep them a little bit at a distance, not so close to each other that they do get in a fight. I think one of the biggest things is to remember is that most likely that seller has put in, a lot of time and energy. They've been, at their very lows with it. They've been at very highs. And if you just kind of walk in and go, hey, it's just a transaction, whatever, and buy the business, and I'm going to, make some money on it, and you kind of treat it that way, that they don't take it that way, right? The way they're taking it is like you're taking their kid from them. So the kind of the more empathy you can have during that transaction and during that phase of it, the better off you're going to have at getting it done. I've actually had it happen to me one time where we completely closed. They signed docs. We didn't release funds. The buyer seller went to dinner together, got in a huge fight, and both called and canceled the transaction. So we had to cancel everything out and take it back. So it's a big deal, and it can really cause some problems. And I've seen the complete opposite, where these guys love each other. They know that, it's going on the way it should. And they're selling it at a big discount. Appraisal comes in, a couple $100,000 above what they're selling it for. And they don't care because they know that their employees are going to be taken care of. Their brand's going to stay where it needs to be, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's a big deal getting the right relationship in place.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great stuff from both of you. I'm going to give our audience one more time to chime in with questions. I have one more sort of, let's finish things out on a sunny note. So what are some of, we talked about like red flags or things that kill deals. Is there anything you'd like to add about things that keep deals alive, or, kind of green flags? Like, hey, when I see this, I have a good feeling that this deal is going to work out.
Yeah, I think working with a really good broker who's experienced and has, really good experience that'll stay involved in the transaction. That, and then also having a really responsive buyer goes a long way. If I'm asking for something and they're giving it to you right away, they're working on trying to actually get it done. They're not, kind of popping in and out for, every couple days, and you're trying to get a hold of them to get something done. If they seem like they're very interested in getting it closed, and they're staying on top of it, usually is going to get done. I'd also say almost just kind of the buyer just being nice. It sounds silly, but it really makes sense. I mean, I've got buyers that are super nice, that are very grateful that we're helping them, or that we're kind of helping get the transaction done, and they're really excited to buy the business, and they're just a happier, nicer person. I'll tell you, I mean, so many people involved in the transaction are willing to go the extra mile and do more for them and help them out, and try to keep it on track, compared to someone who's just a jerk and doesn't really care. The whole time they're making things difficult. You tell them their loan's approved, and they're just like, yeah, whatever, send me the approval letter. And you're just kind of like, man, these people are, we got staff here working, 60, 70 hours a week that are trying to get this done for you, and you don't care. So, you get a little more bees with honey when you're going through the transaction.
Yeah, for sure. We've got a question here from Matt Barnes. He asks, how can buyers help the intermediary manage the emotions of the seller? Is this fully the intermediary's job, or is it wise for the buyer to also help here? What can they do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. Yeah, it's depending on where you're at in the transaction, but I would say this is where a good broker would help out in this situation. So hopefully you're leaning on the sales side broker to manage those emotions of the seller. Now, if you're far down the process, I've seen instances where, so our firm does buy side representation, but we also do sell side representation. But for this particular instance, we was a buy side client, and we almost felt that we ourselves were getting too involved into the process, and we weren't letting the buyer and seller speak to each other. And so, in this case, we actually just called a meeting for them to speak without us involved, right? And so I think, depending on where the transaction or how you've gauged the rapport up until that point, maybe it makes sense for those emotions to be managed between each other, right? And without the intermediaries involved. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'd add a little bit to that. I would just say a lot of times being a little bit more forthcoming with information from the buyer. So if they're working on something, with the transaction, just kind of let them know, this is where I'm at, this is what I'm working on. And there's a lot of sellers that take kind of silence as there's a problem. So if you're not communicating for a week, but they're still working on the transaction, maybe they're just waiting for something to happen, but they're not saying anything, that seller the wheels start spinning, that the transaction's going to go sideways. So being a little bit more forthcoming with information usually helps a lot.
Yeah, thanks guys. Thank you, Matt, for your question. Jarryd Osborne, I want to give you a chance to answer the green flags question before we wrap up. Anything else here?
Yeah, the green flag is motivation, right? On the buy side and the sell side, right? You can and this is me being biased a little bit, our clients that we represent on the buy side, we know they're motivated. They've come to us, they've sought help, they've sought a consultant or advisor. So we know they're a little bit more serious about the transaction. And actually, in many cases, that bodes well for them if there's a bidding going on, right? Not to mention, in some cases, we're retained. So clients paying us a monthly fee. So right there, that tells you the buyer's motivated, right? And so, and then from a seller standpoint, same. Need to see the green flag and motivation. How do you do that? Well, you build that relationship with them. Why are you selling? What's the next chapter? You ask some of those questions, you can start really determining if they're really just testing the market, especially where their valuation is, right? If they're just valued like way out, they're probably just testing the market. You probably shouldn't spend that much time, But if it's a reasonable valuation, you feel like there's a negotiation gap and you like the business, those are green flags, right? But I think motivation is the number one green flag you should look for.
Awesome. All right. Let's do one last quick question, rapid response. Matt has one more. Best business you've ever bought, help buy in the SMB size range, so type, location, etc. So I guess from this question, do you have any, big wins that you want to share as we wrap up here? Let's take it that direction.
Man, it's hard to remember all the transactions over the years. Man, I'm trying to think if there's been quite a few where, they're getting a good deal on it, and you're kind of like, man, I wish I would have bought that. And then there's quite a bit where, I would say like there's so many, it's hard to say, but I think one thing that I really enjoy is when you've got a happy seller and a happy buyer. It's you get the seller that's happy to pass it on to that specific buyer, that buyer that really deserves the business. Maybe they've worked really hard and kind of corporate America maybe had some bad luck along the way, and this is kind of something that's going to work for them, and they're going to take that business and grow it. But it's hard to say, like, there's just so many transactions out there. One I just did, it was a restaurant in Hawaii. The seller was really good guy, had like 4 or 5 restaurants. His restaurant is very, very, very high-end restaurant. They're only open 4 days a week, and it's like 6 months to get a reservation. Sold it to a husband and wife. The husband was a chef. The wife managed the front of the house. He gave it to him at a steep discount, kind of always promised him that he would sell it to them, and came through with his promise. They didn't have a ton of liquidity just from, working in the restaurant industry. And we were able to kind of work with them to structure it a way to be able to get it done. So those kinds of transactions are always nice to see. They know how to operate the business. They're going to kind of take it on. You had a seller who had made his money and, wasn't being greedy and was actually rewarding the employees the way he said they would. So stuff like that's always kind of fun. But yeah, I probably should write down a little bit more of the transactions we do, just because I feel like there's 3 or 4 a week lately, and it's just like they're just kind of boom, boom, boom going on. So yeah.
And you do your weekly or monthly recaps with your kids on LinkedIn.
My kids,
so,
yeah.
If you want sort of a play-by-play, Jarryd wraps those up on a regular basis. So just check those out on LinkedIn. Jarryd Osborne, anything else to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, just real quick. The best business that we worked on is the ones that close. And I wouldn't say this was the best, but one of the recent ones we had was the HVAC company out of California. And going into closing, there was some working capital issues, go figure, that almost held the entire deal up into closing. And so it literally, they were supposed to close on Friday. Didn't happen. Went another week. My partner's going crazy on the side, like he's put in all this work. This deal's about to die. And then the next week, attorneys get involved. They're hashing it out, and then ultimately they end up closing. But it's just sometimes those the best businesses that close are the ones that you don't think are going to close, and they finally end up doing it. And so, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you again for the question, Matt. Thanks to both of the Jarryds. I know we talked a little bit jokingly over email, Josh and the Jarryds as a as a podcast topic, but this was fantastic. Thank you so much for being game to try out this format. Thank you so much for joining us again on the series. Follow Jarryd and Jarryd on Twitter, on LinkedIn. Check out Before You Buy a Business, Jarryd Johnson's podcast. Jarryd Osborne is a recent guest. Subscribe here, Private Market Insights on YouTube. Follow me on Twitter. Lots and lots of good content to come. Thank you so much, everybody. And for everybody out there listening, I hope y'all all have an excellent night.
Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Josh. Appreciate it.